Carol Ruben's poem Emigree is interesting in its title principally. We've got a French word, émigré, and you'll notice the accent there, of course. And we need to think about what that title means as well as what it symbolises. So it is the French word for an emigrant, a person moving away from their country. Don't get it confused with migration and immigration. Obviously, they all come from the same root. Migration is general patterns of movement of population. Immigration is movement into a country. Emigration is forced movement from a country to another country. So the émigré is one person who has had to move because her home is at war. And we might think of the reasons why people have to emigrate. People are forced to move from their home. War is one of the most common ones. It might be because of religious persecution, persecution by sexuality, persecution by race. It's usually forced reasons that people are forced to emigrate or forced to seek refuge. So straight away, we've got to try and be sympathetic with the person who has had to move. And the sense of the French word is deliberate from Carol Ruben's, and again we might think why. It's a deliberate sense of confusion. If somebody has to emigrate, then the first thing that they're going to feel is disorientated. They're away from their family and friends perhaps, they're in a country, and one of the first barriers of course is that language barrier. And the fact that there's a French word, an easily understandable French word, understandably, but because it's a French word, we're supposed to empathise with this language barrier. We're supposed to put ourselves in the position of someone who's had to move because of war and who finds it difficult to settle somewhere else initially because of the language barriers. Okay, so just a word on the title, and I've talked in a few other poems about the title. Bayonet Charge, Charge of the Light Brigade, Remains is an interesting title. Storm on the Island is another one that's got a really interesting title. There's a few titles there that are interesting in themselves, not all of them, but this is one where you could talk about the title as part of your opening paragraph and an introduction. The examiners like to see that you're thinking about the titles that poets give to a poem, because like I've said with conclusions many times, that conclusions are the last thing that a poet leaves you with. Titles and first lines are the first impressions. They're always going to be important. It sets the tone. It sets you thinking, and Emigree certainly starts to get the reader thinking about why that title is a French word. So let's read it through, and then in the three parts that I'm going to film on Emigree, we'll look at each of the three sections, and in the final stanza, the final section of this presentation, we'll look at one or two poems that it links particularly with and the themes. The Emigree. There once was a country. I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear, for it seems I never saw it in that November which, I am told, comes to the mildest city. The worst news I receive of it cannot break my original view, the bright filled paperweight. It may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants, but I am branded by an impression of sunlight. The white streets of that city, the graceful slopes glow even clearer as time rolls its tanks, and the frontiers rise between us, close like waves. That child's vocabulary I carried here, like a hollow doll, opens and spills a grammar. Soon I shall have every coloured molecule of it. It may now be a lie, banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. It tastes of sunlight. I have no passport. There's no way back at all, but my city comes to me in its own white plane. It lies down in front of me, docile as paper. I comb its hair and love its shining eyes. My city takes me dancing through the city of walls. They accuse me of absence. They circle me. They accuse me of being dark in their free city. My city hides behind me. They mutter death, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. So, three stanzas and very different moods in each stanza. And what you might have noticed straight away is the recurring imagery of sunlight. And we'll come on to that, and that's our first key quote. But even if you can't remember all of that, try and remember all of that, because there's plenty we can say about it. But if you can't remember all of that, remember the recurring symbol, the imagery of sunlight. Sunlight is always positive. And so the fact that Every single stanza ends with sunlight. In the second line, we've got, my memory of it is sunlight clear. We know that the poet feels joyous, happy, and very fond of her original country, her original city. And that tone of joy and celebration comes through even in the darkest moments. So remember that repeated imagery, that repeated symbolism of the sunlight, and we'll talk more about it at the end of the first stanza. Let's start at the beginning. There once was a country. Now, that tells us, being in the past tense, that this country now no longer exists, or at the very least no longer exists in the state that it was left by the Emigree. And so the past tense gives us that tone straight away of nostalgia, of fond remembering, but also tinged with sadness, because the past tense and the very phrase "there once was a country, it no longer is" gives us that sense that it's gone, that she's mourning for it, although all the way through that sunlight comes through. It's a fond memory, it's a joyous memory for her. She cherishes her original city. Then we've got the ellipsis. That gives us a natural pause, a caesura in the middle of the first line. And that pause there, after "there once was a country," we know that that's that pause for thought. We're going into a flashback here, and she's talking to us directly as a reader about her memories of her previous city. And that pause for thought allows her to wallow in the joyousness, the beauty, the fond memories she had as a child in her original city. I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear. So we know that she's got very fond memories, very clear memories. They're joyous to her. That imagery of sunlight is so crucial through this poem. It keeps coming through. "For it seems I never saw it in that November, which I am told comes to the mildest city." Now, the little aside, "I am told," is conversational. It's a sense that Carol Rumens, or at the very least the character that Carol Rumens is writing as, the persona that she takes on in this poem, is talking to us directly as a reader. And she's trying to think of reasons why her city is no longer there, or she can no longer live in that city. And we've got the metaphor of November. Now, if you think about where November comes in the year, it comes right at the start of the deepest winter. And that contrasts, that juxtaposes with the mildest city. Mildest as in weather, but also mild as in not at war, peaceful. And so what she's saying here is that for all of us, at some point, conflict will come round. For all cities, at some point, they will be disturbed by conflict. And that is what's happened to her city. The November has come, the very start of winter. And that winter is a metaphor for the darkest times, the coldest times, the hardest times. And in this case, the war that this city has had to go through. So very interesting that she talks that this will happen to everyone at some point, even the mildest city. Maybe that's a warning to all of us. But also it allows her to reassure herself that it happens. It wasn't anything wrong with her city. It's just the natural course of things, that power shifts, and that at some point the shift in power will mean that trouble comes to every city. "The worst news of it I receive cannot break my original view." So whatever she hears, let's imagine she's come to a country where there are flashed on the news images of her previous city. We can think of conflicts right across the world where it's forced emigration, and we see these cities at war which have once been absolutely beautiful, and such is the case in this poem. And no matter what she sees on the news, no matter what news is brought to her, her original view will not be broken. She's going to hold on to that joyous, colourful, fond view, those memories that she cherishes of her original city. And she describes the city as the bright-filled paperweight. Now, there's loads we can say about the bright-filled paperweight. It very nearly became the quote for this particular section. And try and remember it if you can, because there's lots you can say about it. A paperweight. If you don't know what a paperweight is, it's a sort of hemisphere, a half sphere. flat at the bottom and domed at the top. And it's usually made of glass, and its purpose, as the name suggests, is to put on papers to weigh them down. So if you're working at a desk and you've got your window open, it firmly secures your papers in place. Now, you don't usually use them these days. I mean, apart from anything else, we tend to keep our documents on computer or stapled and in a file or something, so it keeps them secure. But a paperweight was an old-fashioned way of doing that, and now people tend to buy them as souvenirs. So if you go to a castle or a river or a seaside place and you buy at those shops, you know, rubbers, pencil sharpeners, key rings, paperweights might be the sort of souvenir that you would buy there too. And so the idea of a souvenir means that it's a cherished memory to her. It's something she wants to remember the city by. So that image of the paperweight reminds her of the joyousness, the happy times in the city. Now, the fact it's a bright filled paperweight, bright, again, colourful, it connotes with happy, doesn't it? So we know that these are cherished, happy memories for her. But also, I think there's a third inference here. She's chosen a paperweight. It could have easily been a keyring or a rubber or a ruler or a hat, whatever it might be. But what does a paperweight do? As I've just said, it weighs down paper. It keeps things secure. So what happens is that this paperweight keeps her memories secure. It secures in her place the fond memories. Nothing can move them because they're weighed down with that paperweight. So really good metaphor for her city. And again, like all of the best images from the poems, you've got 3 levels of interpretation here too. It may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants. So the idea of the city being sick is a personification. The country is personified, the city is personified. Why is it personified? Well, it establishes a close relationship. It's a friendship between the narrator, which may be Carol Rumens, it may be a persona she's taken on. It signifies that close bond between this character and the city that she's had to be moved from. But also the idea of sick is important. What happens when we're sick? Well, usually we get better. So maybe it's an optimistic thought that at some point the city will heal, will get better, she'll be able to return. So it's that sense of optimism, but also that close relationship through the personification of the city being sick. But I am branded by an impression of sunlight. Okay, that's our key quote for this section. And the different colours show that there's at least 4 different things that you can say about this particular quote. First of all, we'll look at the red. Notice the end of every stanza ends in the word sunlight. Why is that? Well, sunlight is an optimistic, joyous image. It's a symbol of joy, of happiness. And the fact that every stanza finishes with that, including the third, much darker stanza, shows that this is something that will always be retained. This joy will always be kept with her. No matter what else happens, the sickness with tyrants, she will always end up feeling cherishing those memories, feeling joyous about the memories that have been brought to her. So that's important, the fact it's repeated at the end of every stanza, its positioning. And the fact that it's symbolic of joy and that sense of joy that it gives is really crucial too. But beyond the sunlight, notice that she is branded with an impression of sunlight. A brand is a bit like a tattoo, but would have been done with hot metal. It's a permanent reminder. It's in a number of poems, the idea of branded. Go to London, for instance, the marks of weakness, marks of woe. So lots you could compare the idea of branded with, but it's the permanent memory. Nothing is going to shake that because it's permanently branded onto her skin, branded into her mind, that impression of joy, of delight, a memory that she really cherishes.